Hi everyone, welcome back to Saris on Screen. The last time we spoke, it was summer, but now it's fall. Guess it's been a while. But we're back for the second half of the season, so let us reintroduce ourselves. I'm Usha,
And I'm Rekha.
and we're still talking about politics, patriarchy, and pop culture. Catch us every other Friday as we do feminist deep dives into South Asian culture and cinema.
In this episode, we will specifically get into queer media in spaces in and beyond Bollywood. While queerness is an aspect of sexuality and identity, we knew that we couldn't have addressed its many nuances in the previous episode where we tackled sex and sexuality in South Asian media. We really wanted to do it justice, and we needed the previous episode to set up the building blocks for this topic.
Yeah, and we clearly had to take some time to process how we would do this. Sorry, guys. But yeah, I think queerness, and especially talking about queerness in our media, requires a lot of energy. It was something we were both personally very excited to do, but also kind of dreading.
Yeah, and I mean, as South Asian queer folks, we know that there's just no examining queerness in our media or queer issues around us without a heavy dose of self reflection, which can be very emotionally challenging when you've had to spend the bulk of your life and potentially the rest of it closeted.
Yeah, and I think it also makes it harder to contextualize it against the privileges that you do have at the other intersections of your identity, which may position you to fare so much better than other queer South Asians. You may have class privilege or caste privilege.
And caste oppression, with its long history of like deeply oppressive practices, also includes controlling sexuality as a part of maintaining caste boundaries. And I think a lot of people don't even realize that a large proportion of the queer community in South Asia are from marginalized caste backgrounds as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And queerness has been othered in heteropatriarchal societies like ours in various ways over thousands of years. And it's easy to presume that this is all just an aftermath of British colonialism. And it is, but it also goes further. But the British can fuck off, like always. Um,
Yeah, definitely. But we are still talking about thousands of years of oppression. And with that, I think we really needed to make these disclaimers before we started that this is a really heavy subject. And that while we may identify as queer, we do have a lot of privileges that we've been given through our class and caste and geographic positions.
Yeah, and that this episode is mostly going to be an analysis of accessible queer media in South Asia and how it impacts the broader modern conversations and issues around queerness today. We realize that these conversations do not exist in a vacuum, and as always, we will make our best efforts to take note of any historical biases that play a role in shaping these conversations, be it caste, class, or ethnicity.
It might not be like entirely comprehensive, but we will do our best to not misinform anyone at the very least. And before we sort of get into our movies, I think it's important to also talk about the kind of queer imagery we've all been exposed to until now. South Asian cinema inherently can be very campy.
Yeah, and to those who are like unfamiliar, camp is this super subversive theatrical aesthetic.
And it's also supposed to be like really gay.
Yeah, and if you want to read more, links are always on our website. I don't think we can do it justice.
But yeah, based on what we were saying earlier, South Asian cinema has never really shied away from being theatrical in the same way that Western cinema might. And while South Asian ideas of camp aren't deconstructive or subversive or ironic in their intention, the same way Western or queer ideas of camp are presented, it could be considered really campy if you looked at something and thought that, hey, isn't it interesting that in this movie, masculinity isn't presented in the same mustache and six pack abs fantasy, but like rather through like long, flowy, sparkly, like gown dresses or outfits or like lip gloss, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think like we've seen that a lot in those like old like Nagin movies where like there we get to see a lot of that sort of like flashy like sort of like aluminum and then sort of like like silver golds and those headpieces and too, right? Um
Yeah.
and it's like obviously we still have a lot of like six packs and abs and like mustaches and things to portray masculinity in media, but it's just to say that South Asian media does contrast
Yeah.
Western masculinity a lot too.
Yeah, and like I mean, with time we're also seeing that our South Asian cinema is sort of embracing this campiness or this subversiveness less and less. Our audiences and our media consumption is becoming more globalized, and there's that need to fit into that ideal cookie cutter man under that whole idea of heteronormativity and patriarchy that society functions under.
Yeah, no, like I think that it's just really sad because like, how the South Asian love for folk theater evolved into love for musical theater and then like musical cinema, which, which is really weird because like like the West will find everything related to like musicals to be like super gay and thus like broadly categorizing most Bollywood movies to be like just gay by default because people are breaking out into dance and song like every like 10 minutes. And I think that there's this just, and I agree with you that there's this like greater push towards like more heteronormativity, and we
Mhm.
see a lot of it in these movies these days. There's in these like smarter movies, the Oscar contenders, where you only have music in the montages and no singing and dancing in your movie, and like whatnot. Because, you still need to have a soundtrack in a movie because, how else are you going to sell it in South Asia? But
Right.
you need to be smarter because how else are you going to sell it to a white audience?
And that aversion to sort of like musical theater is like really rooted in that gay equals bad narrative, that's very prevalent in South Asia and even in the West to some degree. And with globalization, with more information, more awareness, I think the idea of what is gay or what is queer even keeps changing as well.
I mean, everywhere the idea is that gay is bad, and when like global ideas of what is gay keeps changing and gets pushed into South Asia starts to look at its own art as like bad, and that brings up the question: what is considered gay in South Asia, and outside of the sort of like global context and everything, and like what imagery specifically, and what are the implications of it? Like from my personal experiences watching like Bollywood and like Bangladeshi movies, we'll see like eyelinered villains, in Bollywood specifically we'll see like eyeliner villains, like thick
Yeah,
heavy
for
eyeliner.
sure.
Like I was watching like Padmavat the other day and Ranveer Singh, like he's playing like a Muslim and obvious, and then like he like has like the thickest eyeliner, and I'm like, okay, this is like not a new thing because like this is a dig at queerness, this is just plain old Islamophobia. Like, or in Bangladesh we'll see like the opposite, we'll see like more like sort of like Hindu elements like to make digs at like queerness. This is that sort of
Right.
like thing that will happen. Is like when you want to make digs at queerness, but you also use imagery that is tied with other sort of political and like ethnic minorities
Absolutely.
to like
Yeah.
sort of like make it more derogatory to two groups at once. But yeah, but I think like very specifically what we wanted to talk about is like the one when we think about queer characters in like Bollywood or is Indian or like South Asian cinema, we'll always think of this one character, right? Often fat, often like effeminate, high pitched voice, this,
Mhm.
this like cheruby sort of like figure who like be the butt end of a joke and is sometimes used to push like narratives more insidious than like just that, right? Um
Yeah, and they're like so often queerness and like even these other minorities are sort of equated with sexual deviancy, and then they're sort of portrayed to be predatory and they'll be used to push this already horrible narrative around queer people that they're out to get you and that they're like sexually abnormal and they're sexually othered in a way where they're made out to be threatening to the rest of the society. And straight people essentially.
like what will somebody think of the kids? Like that's
Yeah.
always a thing. Like, will somebody think of the children? But yeah,
What
like
will the children think? Oh my god.
yeah. And I think, yeah, like all of it is ultimately super dehumanizing, and it helps to perpetuate this negative idea around queerness in our societies, which was only made worse during the AIDS epidemic. Like, in the 80s and 90s, like there was that whole thing, like, oh yeah, like not just in like the West, but also in South Asia, where it's like, oh yeah, like gay equals AIDS, like, and like if you're choosing
Mhm.
to be gay, you're choosing death, and this is horrifying. Like all of that, like, just like AIDS panic thing that was happening to also demonize, like, homosexuality, and
Mhm.
without any conversation about safe sex, because God forbid anyone talk about safe sex in South Asia. But yeah, like I
Absolutely
think the
not.
problem always comes down to the fact it's like it's never a mindless one-time joke, right? There's always worse and like further repercussions of these jokes, and sometimes it can lead to like life-threatening like safety issues for people, because when you're a queer kid at a school and someone feels threatened for some reason, you can be beat up because they watched some movie yesterday and you seem like, kind of gay, and now you deserve to be like, beat up on the streets and then killed or something. And I think those are the implications that people never think about when they're like, oh, just take a joke, bro. Like, is your sexuality standing on such a thin line? Can't you take a joke? We all take a joke. And it's like, yeah, like it's easier to take a joke when your life doesn't fucking depend on it.
Yeah, definitely. And because I think we've seen so many queerphobic, transphobic, and homophobic representations of, the community in our cinema, it's even harder to actually criticize when we have like any of the movies, when we have such few really good ones, especially in the mainstream. And I mean, I know there have been really good art house movies over the years and some really good queer representations in regional South Asian cinema. But those are also for very niche audiences, right?
Yeah, and like they might not always be like accessible. And I think we do want to like, always give a shout out to like, the iconic, lesbian movie from the 90s, Fire, or like, Ritu
Mm-hmm.
Parna Ghosh, who was, one of the few openly queer like Indian directors and also a Bengali. But unfortunately, we realize that those movies may be a lot harder to access for queer South Asians, like, in today than, something that might have come out in the last 5 years. And
Definitely. But yeah, I think what we were like trying to get at earlier is that it's really hard to actually comment on queer cinema when it feels like such a big deal to even have any in the first place. And in this episode, what we're going to try to do is both like celebrate the queer cinema we have, but also critique it from an intersectional lens. And while we recognize that it's a huge deal to be in a position to talk about South Asian queer cinema at all, but we also have to tell ourselves that there's room for better queer representation and better queer cinema overall.
yeah, and that it's okay for us to not just demand representation, but thoughtful, well-rounded, and enjoyable representations as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, I really hope we'll all get to have this and we live in a South Asia where queerness is not just tolerated, but also openly accepted, normalized, and even celebrated.
And yeah, this is the perfect opportunity to introduce the movies for this episode, which again, we can't express just how grateful we are that they even exist.
Absolutely. So we're super excited that we actually watched our first Kannada movie for the season for this episode, and we really wanted to highlight it first. It's called Naanu Avanalla Avalu, and I'm really sorry that I can't pronounce it right. But I think that's one of the fun things about doing this podcast too, that we get to watch movies that we really wouldn't have been, exposed to otherwise, or
Hmm.
just wouldn't have been that accessible to us.
But yeah, for those of us who aren't well versed in Canada, this movie translates to "I'm she, not he," and it explores the real life story of a transgender woman, an artist and activist living Smile Vidya, and and specifically explores like her struggles to navigate her personal relationships with her family, the institutional barriers that she comes across in finding employment and housing, and like just like her transition process overall. And we also get to see how she finds herself and was like finally able to transition like medically, like, and like
Mhm.
how the process is really hard without like access to like, like safe healthcare, and like also the sort of help that she received through the ritualistic care of the Hijra community in the area. And
Mhm.
also, and like I think that it was really interesting to see throughout the movie, to see her like reconcile her privileges that she had compared to the rest of the people in her community, because in the movie
Mhm.
we get to see that she has a master's degree, she also is like, very like skilled, and comes
Right.
from like, relative privilege, and
That's true. Yeah.
and we see her trying to navigate a space where people are sort of forced to engage in like sex work and needing to beg to survive, and we see her struggle between her desire for community but also for a life of dignity, which society like fails to provide, not just for her but also everyone else who doesn't subscribe to like these conventional ideas of like gender.
Absolutely. And I think this movie will really help us, talk about the broader like transgender representation in South Asia, and also this difference between traditional South Asian ideas of gender queerness, or non-gender binary identities, versus how Western narratives and vocabulary of queerness frames those ideas as well, and how they kind of all tie into our politics and our media.
Yeah, and like the thing is that all these different communities, these different identities that like sort of like we see in our society, like all these different facets of our identities affect how we are queer, right? And that's why it's like
Exactly.
important to sort of see like there is no queerness and there is no queer media without talking about queerness and how it manifests in different sort of like identities in South Asia. And that's why we wanted to really look at Geely Pucci, which was one of the like recent movies that look at like intersections of like caste and like queerness. And
Mm-hmm.
this was a short starring Kankana Sen and Aditi Rao Hedari, directed by Niraj Khewan, Dalit director. And in this short, Kankana is a Dalit queer factory worker and is very much presented as like a masked lesbian. And we kind of see like, Aditi as this more femme and like closeted wife from like a more priestly like Brahmin family, and the story sort of explores this like sort of intersection of their identities, particularly Kankana's like lack of privileges in trying to climb out of her blue collar job into a higher paid one,
Mm-hmm.
and how like she's sort of like stopped at sort of every stage because like they just don't want her in those spaces. And even
Right.
as their relationship like unfolds, and we see like Aditi like, breaking away from like the heteronormative expectations placed on her, she ultimately can't break away from like the caste like sort of like structures that like bind them, right?
Mm-hmm.
She like gives in and is like very complicit in those like very systems that oppress Kankana's character. And Kankana realizes that these differences and in their like socioeconomic and caste differences and their like caste standings and their lived experiences would ultimately make their relationship super unviable.
Yeah, and I think like there aren't a lot of movies and there aren't a lot of conversations happening in South Asia about this intersection of like queerness and caste. And that's why we really wanted to include this movie, because this is just an issue that deserves to be highlighted. But also, in saying that, we will sort of give this disclaimer that neither of us may be the best equipped to
Hmm.
discuss caste in great length. So we will try to have a guest in the future who's much better informed and much better equipped than we are to sort of discuss these issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, much of what we try to discuss in this episode is mostly like what we took from the director's interview, like specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is mostly to like, bring up the topic in this episode and not to like be like sort of the experts on the topic or anything.
Absolutely.
And the thing is that, like, the whole episode has a very limited scope to something that is like a much bigger issue in South Asia. But
Mm,
like, I think that we also like just really wanted to touch on something that is a very important element of queerness in South Asia. And
absolutely.
but yeah, like, aside from that, I think that one other thing that we were also very interested in doing is looking at what popular media was doing in terms of like queer sort of movies and like queer cinema. And there's surprisingly been a lot of it in recent times. And like, like more than one, which is like, already like a lot.
Yeah, it's
But
a big deal.
it's a
Yeah.
bbig deal. And I think that like it's been very interesting because like how queerness is being like packaged to like, the mainstream audience, and is not just, in like sort of like behind Netflix paywalls, or just, Amazon Prime paywalls or whatever. Like if it's like actually going to theaters, or if it's actually in like television, like advertisements, like how is this like queerness like being like packaged, right?
Mm.
I think like that's why we chose like Shubh, Mangal, Zyada, Saavdhaan, and Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga.
Yeah, and I mean, Shubh Mangal Zyada Saavdhaan is like another in a series of, social issue movies by Ayushman. And this time he's sort of trying to tackle his closeted boyfriend's family and their sort of very comically portrayed homophobia. And he's trying to prevent his boyfriend from like getting into an arranged marriage of like convenience. And I mean, Ayushman looks really hot in a nose ring, that's for sure. Like, that was like one of
Yeah.
the highlights of this movie for
Yeah, no,
me.
definitely.
But also, like, this movie was like maybe an hour too long, I think. And it's very clear. I mean, even though it's very clear, we've come a long way from Dostana, where you only see two famous male actors kissing each other as like this queer baiting sort of tactic, and just they're pretending to be gay even in the movie. And here we actually have like a movie trying to tackle what coming out could be in a South Asian context in a very lighthearted way. So that's something I did appreciate about the movie as well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, like I really like that. Like I think we don't get to see enough queer joy, and we will definitely get into the importance of that like later in this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another thing is that, since we were watching a movie about two gay men, we thought it was only fair to watch a movie about, a lesbian relationship, which surprise surprise is about a straight man. Like, that's what Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga was about. Where Sonam Kapoor plays what she plays best, which is, a rich daughter to Anil Kapoor's like character. Wonder where she learned how to play that. But like also, like, but like also like I think what just like also like a bad part of the movie, like before I get into the good part, is like she was really struggling to play like a queer character in it, because like for the first half of the movie I just thought she was really into the dude who like this movie was about, which like I don't even want to get into the plot of the movie. Like, if anyone wants to watch it, they can just go watch it. This is half the movie is about like how this dude wants to like, like is in love with her, and then is wants to be a writer. But to give the movie like some credit, their depiction of homophobia in South
Mm-hmm.
Asia is a lot more in depth than like Shov Mangal's one, which was like too comical almost. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
like it almost like felt like it was undermining the sort of like impact of like
Definitely
homophobic
minimizing.
behavior
Yeah.
in like, sort of like, and its impact on people. Like Sonam Kapoor's brother was super horrifying and very violent, and like it felt like, that sort of gaslightiness that often comes with it. And then we got to also see like a lot about her like sort of queer childhood, that sort of confusion, that sort of fears that come with it. And then we also got to see like that sort of, lightness that comes with acceptance. And then finally, like, so Anil Kapoor, when he like accepts her at the end, like, it's just
Right.
like super welcoming, like, like loving moment. And like I cried, like I'll admit it, I cried. It was like, I don't get to see it in a brown setting, I cried. But
Right,
yeah.
for sure.
um But ultimately the movie is about a straight dude and how he couldn't get laid and made a lesbian friend. So take what you will from this. um
Yeah, and I mean, everything said and done, it is amazing to be at a point in South Asian media where we are actually seeing, consecutive queer films being made, and they're trying to represent queer stories, and they're backed by like Bollywood star power. And I think that's a really big deal. But I think as queerness becomes more marketable or more socially acceptable, how is it portrayed and how are these characters portrayed? And so, I mean, through these movies, we're hoping to really get into these ideas of, queer baiting, queer coding, and this balancing act of, Western versus Desi queerness, and how important it is ultimately to actually see real queer joy on the screen as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, like, as important as it is to see lighthearted portrayals of queerness, it's also important to have like multi-dimensional queer characters and explorations of like various intersections of their identity on screen, right? Because our queerness is not separate from who we are, and that's something that I think we end up like sort of reiterating over like all of our episodes, that none of our identities exist in vacuum from each other, whether it's our sexualities, whether it's how we express our sexualities or our queerness or anything. It's
Hmm.
all sort of compounded by like sort of our class identities, our caste identities, our like geographic, ethnic, like all of these like sort of like stacks of our like other like identities, right? And
Absolutely.
like these are things that impacted our abilities, right? These are all things that are impacted by it, and that's why I think like we need to see movies where we see like intersections of all of this, and that's why we watched Margarita with the Straw.
Yeah, and Margarita with a Straw is a coming of age story, actually, of a teenager with cerebral palsy, and she's played by Kalki Koechlin. So Kalki Koechlin is moving to America to study, and the movie really explores her relationship with her mother, who's her like primary caregiver, and how she explores her own sexuality, because she's dating a queer blind woman played by Saini Gupta. And it also tries to explore that intersection of disability and queerness, as well as how queerness manifests differently, even within people from similar cultural backgrounds, like Kalki and Sayani were shown to be.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think it's not a bad movie, but I don't know if it's necessarily like a good movie, I guess,
Hmm.
is where I'm at with it.
Before we get into like Margarita with the Straw, I think we should really, start with the fact that, we haven't really had a chance to talk about disability and its representation in the media in this podcast before. And it's a really comprehensive topic, right? And we really do hope to do it justice in a future episode and dedicate it entirely to this topic. And
Absolutely. And, hopefully we'll actually have experts who would be able to explain it a lot better than we can.
yeah, and but I think like due to the limited scope of this episode, we like wanted to highlight a few key issues as it pertains to the intersections of disability, media, and queerness. And to specifically go into like disabilities, both like mental and physical ones, the thing is that they've been demonized in our media and our society for as long as like we can remember, and even like right even like now,
Hmm.
right? Disabilities, much like queerness, stray away from ideas of normativity,
Hmm.
and disabilities have also been demonized from straying away from ideas of productivity and
Right.
reproductivity. It's not that, like, and I think we'll often see in our society specifically use words like, normal and like, abnormal used, constantly, like, and thrown around, when these words are often rooted in like, very strict concepts of like what is productive, and it's often from ideas of neoliberal productivity. And
Hmm.
in a capitalistic world where you're valued for your ability to work, it's not surprising that these ideas get solidified more and more, and then the media perpetuates them like further.
Yeah, and I mean, even when we look at recent movies about like, differently abled characters, they're often boxed into this sort of tragedy versus triumph dichotomy. Like their stories can be only either one of those. And both of these kinds of stories are kind of banking on the audience being like super pitying and sympathetic of people who may be
Mm-hmm.
differently abled, or they continue to sort of like perpetuate those ideas of medical models of disability, and that people have to pretty much undergo like intense medical procedures just to feel normal. And this idea of normal, as you mentioned, is just like, it's so arbitrary because there's literally nothing that is normal or not normal. And often I think these movies just completely ignore sort of the systemic structures around
Mm-hmm.
differently abled people that inhibit them from living, full, authentic lives and just navigate through society with ease.
Yeah, and I think like, like that's the thing, that it's never society's fault. It's always like this individual blame. Like, we see it like, what like we see it like this is like sort of the problem with sort of that sort of capitalistic sort of view on things. Like if you're not rich, it's your fault. If you're struggling to get by in society, it's your body's fault. It's not like, society's fault, right? And like we see it in like sort of, a lot of the media will often like do that, like as you were saying. But like I think an example of a media that we saw that was, celebrated for being different in South Asia was Tarza Meeper, which, focus more on the need for accommodations instead of, focusing on like the disability being like, like the bad, right?
Right.
And it focused on the abuse that often results when accommodations aren't available, right?
Hmm.
But there's also like other tropes that Tarizamiper ended up like perpetuating, and
Yeah.
like, which often limits disability representation, things like just like tokenization, and then being the object of pity in a movie, or just, just being like inspiration porn, which is damaging in its like own way, or, being that sort of eternally innocent asexual saint, which, like is an, we constantly see that a lot of the times in these sort of movies.
Yeah, and I think what often these movies try to do is completely separate sexuality from being differently abled. And that's just not like a thing, because queerness and even like straight sexuality are still like linked to the rest of a person's identity, like we talked about. And the sad thing is that like queer spaces, despite wanting to be inclusive, can be extremely unaccommodating to differently
Mm-hmm.
abled or neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we rarely sort of see these stories about differently abled queer or like straight people even just living their life and going through something that all of us go through, like dating. And I think we'd like to really shout out Ryan O'Connell's special on Netflix and Ryan Haddad's play Hi, Are You Single? Um, but these portrayals, I think, are even rarer when we look at like South Asian television or cinema. And they're often very like straight, cis and straight male and white or cis centered. And that's just like definitely
Mm-hmm.
a problem.
Yeah, and I think that that's why when we heard about a queer movie where like, it was a differently abled women exploring their relationship, we knew we really wanted to explore it for this episode. But
Hmm.
I think we were just a little disappointed, unfortunately, and like it started just with the director themselves, right? Margarita with the Straw was directed by a bisexual able-bodied woman, Shonali Bose, who was inspired to write this after her cousin with cerebral palsy asked again and again to be the topic of her film. But Shrinali Bose didn't feel like it was a sexy enough topic until, like, her cousin started telling her that she wanted to have sex, because this is like a quote from the director where the director's like, oh, over all these years I'd never dealt with her sexuality, and that in India we haven't dealt with sexuality of the disabled, and that excited me as the filmmaker. And it's like that's such a like I don't know,
Ableist.
it's
Yeah.
a really gross thing to say, but yeah, like it's like I don't know. Like, I get that they have this like emotional element of like, oh yeah, they combine both of their identities into like Kalki's character. But also like just how she talked about like, oh, a movie about cerebral palsy is like boring like about the everyday lives of someone with cerebral palsy is boring unless, it's something sexy enough for the director is also just such an ableist like, and it's just such a odd just like fetish.
Yeah,
I don't know. There's something like just off about that comment. I don't know. It makes me
definitely.
like not surprised about like how blasé she was about like this whole like casting process, like overall, like because she was just like, oh yeah, like it's too hard to find disabled actors who'll also play like queer roles. Which like we hear that a lot and a
Yeah,
lot
and I
in
mean,
Bollywood.
this is like a problem across like all the movies that have been about, differently abled people, whether it's Tare Zameen Par or like My Name is Khan or Hitchki or Koi Mil Gaya. They will just literally never cast
Mm-hmm.
differently abled actors. And there's always an excuse for it. Like, oh, they're not
Mm-hmm.
famous or it's not marketable or just something very arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. And like I get that there's a bit more nuance to it. That on one hand, if it's a new actor, there's a issue of privacy, the fear of public backlash. Bollywood's already nepotistic as shit. So like if you're already coming in with like no like sort of institutional like sort of like support, you fear like whether you'll get jobs after this and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But like also on the other hand, like Zoya Akhtar cast like a literal like child on Bombay Talkies to play like a queer role, and if she could manage that, like I don't understand if how Shonali Bose with all her influence like couldn't. Like I get it, but I also don't get it. Like I mean, like this is the thing. Like I feel like in Hollywood movies, it's a lot easier to be like very like strictly outraged about representation,
Mm-hmm.
but like over here I'm willing to give that sort of like 10% leeway on like whatnot. Oh my
Differently.
god,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think it made it like actually super hard to watch. I remember like Usha was like really sort of like uninvested
I could
when we
not
were
finish. I'll
watching
be
it.
honest, I try to watch all the movies that we like decide to watch for the show, and I could not watch this movie. It was awful. I could not sit through it.
Yeah,
Just
and I mean, even while like even though I watched it, like I went through it and everything, it was really uncomfortable for me to at
mhm.
different points to be watching them. And even though they're like really good actresses, this is no like comment on Kalki or Sayani Gupta, but like even though they're really good actresses, knowing that they're able-bodied and they're just sort of pretending to be differently abled was just very
Mhm.
upsetting, like as a
Yeah.
viewer of the movie.
Yeah, and it just felt like almost like a mockery of it. I remember this one scene like during their date where Cyanese character is like looking off like like her eyes glazed over at some side, and like she's supposed to be blind, right?
Mm,
And the thing is that I understand that when someone is disabled, like that is something that can happen, and she's trying to like mimic, she's trying to act. I
mhm.
understand that is what is trying to happen, but the fact that the
You're
actress
also
is,
aware that she's
yeah,
trying to act,
act. And
that's
yeah,
the
I think
problem.
just the constant awareness of it just never left me. Or like when Kalki's just like just doing like things, like it just never left me that in between takes she was walking around and
Mhm.
just being like able-bodied, and then she got back on her chair and then she pretended to be like disabled, and there was something just very off-putting about that. And then you can
Definitely.
say that like, oh yeah, Usha, why don't you have a problem with like like other cases where like straight people act as trans characters, or like when straight people act as gay characters? I'm like, I do have a problem with it, but I think there's the severity of it is just a little worse because like because I think disabled people have been more excluded from like just cinema overall. And I think that a
That's
lot of gay
definitely
people
true.
got in on the DL like over the years, but I don't think as many disabled people could get into the industry over the years.
Yeah, I think one of the other really sort of problematic aspects of this movie was, queer stereotypes, especially like stereotypes about bisexual people. So
Mhm.
Kalki's supposed to be bisexual and she's shown to be like, cheating on Sayani Gupta with
Mhm.
this white guy. And it just sort of perpetuates that idea again that like bisexual people are just
Mhm.
like super slutty and they have like unending sexual appetites and
Mhm.
want to sleep with everyone, you
Yeah,
know?
and you think like a bisexual director wouldn't like end up perpetuating one of
Yeah.
the like worst stereotypes about bisexual people, like, oh, you can't be monogamous, right? And like, and not to say she like Shonali Bose isn't like a good director. Obviously, she is like very great cinematography, very like great like feminine gaze, all that jazz. And very queer gaze on that too, like, and when we say queer gaze we see a lot, very much softer, warmer lighting and cozier spaces, very like more sensual touch when she's with like Sayani. We see a lot of that versus
Mhm.
very rough cold lighting and like very aggressive when it's with like the white guy, right? And like when the thing with queer gaze is like whenever we say gaze, it's just as long as it's not het
It's just perspective, yeah.
perspective. It's a very queer perspective. But like, Shonali Gaze is obviously very talented, and it's very great to see differently abled people in loving romantic relationships, not being pitied and not being inspiration porn. But also like, could somebody else be cast to do this?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And let's not like erase like actual disabled people while doing this, right? Um
I mean, definitely. I think that's super important. And like, I mean, this is a movie about a queer person and like about, the process of being queer, accepting queerness also. And I feel like that part was kind of like glossed over in the movie partially because Kalki comes out to her mom and like at first they make a joke about it because she's like, I'm
mhm.
bi. And her mom's like, oh, I'm a bi. And she's referring to like the sort of
Mhm.
word that we use for
Yeah.
like a domestic worker, which is buy, because she's like, I do all the work. And then they just kind of like, they show her mom being like really pissed when she realizes, but we never really get to see that closure or that process of acceptance because very soon after that, her mom falls sick. And so the whole like sexuality thing is just like kind of in the background and it's just kind of understood that now that she's sick, she's cool with it. So
Mhm.
I feel like they could have done that part like a lot more
Yeah.
justice, but they
Yeah.
didn't.
I mean, yeah, like I feel like so yeah, like this movie was also like ultimately about self-acceptance and like coming out. And I get that everybody has a lot of qualms about like coming out stories because of how like dramatic they are. And I get that they eat up like
Hmm.
space from like other queer stories and they're super dramatic to revisit, but we haven't had a lot of coming out stories in South Asia, right? Like, but also at the same time
Barely,
I
yeah.
yeah, also at the same time I understand that coming out is a very Western thing. Like, we don't need to have coming out be sort of the central sort of pivotal moment in sort of queer South Asian sort of like um idealization of our sort of queerness, right? And like especially in like sort of collectivist, overly patriarchal cultures like ours, I think that there's different ways to realize, and there are different ways that queerness is realized, right? And I think we'll keep discussing this as we go through our episode, how like self-acceptance and just realizing that you're queer can sometimes be like a much bigger deal than coming out. But sometimes coming out may be essential, and like how those lines can like vary based on like where you are and what you're doing specifically and how your
Hmm.
queerness manifests, right? Coming out is all great and everything, and it'd be great to have that for everyone, but also at the same time I think we should accept that there are other cultural ways to be queer, and that until we figure out a way to do that for South Asian cultures for ourselves, we shouldn't really disparage South Asian queer people for those of us who, choose to, survive and be safe, where, our, safety and community are on the line, and,
Definitely.
putting that first over like coming out.
I think this is also like, a good time to talk about Nanu Avanalla Avalu, or I'm She, Not He, which is a movie that actually does explore coming out and these queer scenarios in a very South Asian setup.
Mhm.
And I think it also tries to, talk about that discrimination and marginalization that queer or trans people face when they try to live their lives in an authentic way. And I mean, while like obviously the main actor who's playing Vidya is not a trans person, um, I think the good thing about the representation that we felt was actually that he spent a lot of time with the local
Mhm.
Hijra community before acting in this
Mhm.
movie, to give him that additional context and actual like understanding of their lived experiences a little bit more.
And like I think that another good thing, like, like while, that still could have been an improvement for the casting, there's
Mhm.
also like, something that can be appreciated, like honestly, is that the side cast was like, primarily all like members of the Hijra community, local Hijra community, and
Mhm.
that is something that was really great. And I think overall there was a lot of thought and consideration behind the portrayal and the adaptation of this like movie, because,
Mhm.
and this can be attributed to the fact that this is, a real life story, and this is a story of a trans and Dalit rights activist called Living Smile Vidya, and she played a considerable role at the set of the movie and in the production process, like. And I think, when someone is so involved in the process, we really get to see it in the sort of end result of the movie.
Mhm.
And I think we get to see it throughout the movie. Like we see like Vidya's internal state of mind in like a lot of the scenes, like whether it's how she's feeling about like how someone's reacting, or how someone, how she's feeling in her like sort of childhood years, and like when she sees her like sister, or like, when she sees like sort of like her first like crush and everything, or like how she feels like in the bus when there's all these men around, like these internal states of minds, like I feel like those things just don't come out of like a straight cis dude's mind, like. And I think that those are the things that I really really appreciated.
Yeah, and I think that's the level of, authenticity and autonomy we'd like all queer and trans people to
Mm-hmm.
have over the
Absolutely.
stories being told about them. But I think before we really get into the details of the movie, I would really like to talk about, the Hijra community, which has sort of existed parallelly to this gender binary culture across time in South Asia. They've been here since like pretty much the start of like any
Mm-hmm.
civilization in our parts of the world. And I think a lot of people in contemporary India, especially like a lot of Hindus in contemporary India specifically, like to claim that the Hijra community started being marginalized because of the British or the Mughals. But their marginalization and, their peripheralization within society has also existed across all of these, all this political leadership, whether that's, ancient Hindu kings or like Mughal kings or like the
Mm-hmm.
British.
And there's always been like a very like sort of like caste element to like this marginalization, like always, right? and
Right.
like and like because they're like, with like a lot of the sort of marginalization that like predates sort of like Mughals and the Brits and everything,
Mm-hmm.
there's always that sort of marginalization on the basis of caste that happened to like indigenous and sort of like queer people like in the past. And that's something that we should like always like keep in mind.
Yeah, I think I also wanted to just talk about the term hijra and how it's not necessarily like an interchangeable like synonym for the
Mm-hmm.
term trans. The
Mm-hmm.
the term hijra is like a lot more diverse, and it can It can mean trans, it can mean intersex, it can just mean anyone who doesn't want to be
It's
identified.
yeah, and in like South Asia, like it's been more of like a community term, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's been used as sort of like a community term for anything existing outside of the cis binary in like South Asia. And this is like
Absolutely.
not to like begrudge the transgender people in the West or their politics or their terminologies, but merely accepting that that there's when you try to impose western terminologies on like sort of all like sort of indigenous queer identities, it poses risks of like erasures of like gender
Absolutely.
diverse identities in other cultures. We can often see this happen to like the mujas of like Mexico, but oftentimes many people don't have a choice but to accept western terms sometimes
Mm-hmm.
because like
Yeah.
it feels like more accessible. And but I think that it's very important for us to be cultural aware when addressing issues of the community, like you
Absolutely.
know and it's also important to just stop using like these blanket western catch-all sort of terms, because that often leads to using like western catch-all blanket queer
So
solutions for problems
yeah.
that might need like different solutions, right?
I think there are a lot of like different, connotations to being like part of the Hijra community in South Asia. And that's like something we don't often like get to like see in movies. So, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
movies, when we see people from the Hijra community, have this very like, again, binarizing sort of portrayal, right? That
Mm-hmm.
people from that community are either shown to be like overtly very sexual, like if they're,
Mm-hmm.
engaged in sex work or something, or they're considered asexual. And if you like read some accounts from people within the Hijra community, they actually think of sexuality as a spiritual thing versus a sexual thing in that sense, because
Mm-hmm.
in Hinduism there's this idea of Shiv and Shakti, which is like the
Mm-hmm.
masculine and feminine like energies of the universe sort of like
Mm-hmm.
together being super powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hijra community is supposed to sort of embody that idea and sort of be closer to, divinity in that sense than like
Mm-hmm.
cis people
Yeah.
ever could be.
I mean, it's very fetishy in that sense, like
But it
very like
is,
it's
yes.
like divine fetishy, but it's still fetishy ultimately,
Yeah,
right?
I think the idea
Um,
is really nice, but like the way it's sort of
yeah,
executed is
and
very
and I
fetishizing.
think it's like sad because like this is oftentimes like like I mean oftentimes in the West we'll see like transgender people in the West are often subject to the same sort of like like
Mm-hmm.
fetishization that is often like that's a sort of secret fetishization that often happens, right? And then on the other end of the world we'll get this sort of like other bizarre sorts of like like divine sort of fetishizations that happen, while at the same time like just constant oppression that just never like stops, right? And like even like I mean to like like sort of look at like just coming back to sort of like film theory slightly, like big
Mm-hmm.
jump here, but like like with like heterosexual male like gaze on transgender people is often super violent and like it's
Mm-hmm.
pitiful and
Definitely.
violent. Like I don't know if you've seen like but like the movie the Danish Girl, the one with Eddie Redmayne, in that movie, like and like most movies with transgender people are often like as you said, like that binarization where they're like they're often engaged in sex work, or like even when they're very like sort of quote unquote pure, they'll be subject to like
Oh
violence
yeah.
from heterosexual like men, and will often get that sort of like very like pervasive gaze at them, where you're like you have to watch them be like like violently like abused, right? And this is why like like queer film theorists will propose an alternative, the transgender gaze, where you get to see look at the world from the perspective of trans people, rather than look at them in that sort of like pity, sort of like look at them just be sort of like beat up by the world, right?
Or just
And
dehumanize
or
them. Yeah.
dehumanized by the world, right? And I think like I am Sheena, he allows for that to like a degree, and we see some of that gaze. Like, we constantly are in Vidya's mind. We get to look at the
Mhm.
world as Vidya experiences it. We get to see Vidya be in love with her childhood friend. We get to see Vidya's confusion and like desire for her, like, sisters, like, clothes and mother's jewelry. We get
Mhm.
to see like all of that sort of like, like those like
Yeah,
those like sort
without the judgment, like, and
without
I
the
think
judgment. Yeah, and we also get to experience Vidya's joy upon like self acceptance of like, all of it, right? And we get to experience Vidya's like sadness, and it's never like just violence, right?
yeah.
Like it's never just that. And I think that is such an important element of watching queer movies that people never talk about. Like, queer movies are so violent for no reason
Mhm.
all the time, and we never just get to see people be like human.
People. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And this movie could have a lot of flaws. Like, it does. Like, some of it could be like just insensitive portrayal, some of it just is like, not that great, but like
And obviously,
ultimately
we might be missing some of
we
the
might
very
be missing a lot
specific
of the
linguistic.
context, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
and the thing is that, like, I mean, there's also a lot of cultural context that we might have also missed on this. But the thing
Absolutely.
is, well, it felt very good to see a movie that highlighted so much of a queer person's experience and their whole life.
Absolutely. I think one of the other things, you mentioned this briefly, but I really liked that instead of sexualizing her or like asexualizing her, they actually sort of created that space where, a trans person could like experience romance, like
Mm-hmm.
in a very human, like universal way. Because we see, how shyly she's looking at her like childhood friend who she's in love with. And you can pick up on those cinematic cues. And I was really touched by that personally
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah.
But I think, I mean, this movie isn't like all like, rainbows and unicorns, obviously, because it does also go into, with their struggling with employment and like trying to find this sense of community. And even when she does sort of get welcomed into the Hijra community, um, there's this like sense of dread because the whole community is so horribly marginalized
Mm-hmm.
in like different aspects of public life, whether that's healthcare or just institutional support. Like, I've heard all these like I think if anyone wants to check out like some trans like South Asians, you guys should really check out V Queer and Trin Trin on Instagram. And they talk a lot about, trans experiences with navigating sort of the social setup and how institutionally there's just this entire lack of support because of all these documentation issues and like these very arbitrary, like dumb things that people just won't change to be more inclusive.
Yeah, and it's dumb. I mean, it's dumb. But it's insidious, and it's done on
Yeah,
purpose to keep people like out and keep people like certain people in power and certain people out, right? And that this has been this way for a very long time. Like, and it's just really, and just the complete intolerance of it all, and just the huge dangers to physical and mental safety that it like poses on this like community. Right. But this movie does a really great job of conveying that sense of insecurity in public. And, we see like Vidya get harassed by the cops, and then, how she's like constantly like, trying to reconcile like her privilege of having like education and some class privilege compared to like, her other community members. But
mm-hmm.
also, we get to see the movie end with Vidya attempting to come out to her parents with her new identity. And then we get to see a lot of the trauma of coming out in these South Asian settings again. But like, in this scenario, I mean, as we were talking about it, like, the need to come out and, sort of the dangers of coming out is a balance that often queer South Asians have to like sort of like very much weigh every single time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that, and it can be super dangerous when like literally honor killings are of everyday reality for like a lot of South Asians. And,
Absolutely.
and queer South Asians, I can't imagine, like, I can't imagine like how stressful it is. And like, I'm in the closet, this is like,
Mm.
we're in the closet. This is, a luxury
Yeah.
that we get to, like a very luxurious closet that we get to stay in. But the thing is that, not to say that Western narratives of coming out can't be dramatic, but there's something at the end of that tunnel, right? You get these nice queer spaces, you get like sub communities, you get, most of the times you get to have a job or healthcare. Not to, like, disregard like the higher instances of like houselessness and like and mental health issues in like queer like youth in the West. But like, I ultimately, like, again, I'll keep saying this again and again, like I won't disparage a brown kid for opting to not come out. But again, like, this is something that Rekha and I want to keep reiterating, that we're not
Absolutely.
excusing, like, our toxic patriarchal like cultures, like,
But
because
I think like the queer people who exist in our culture should be like given the space to like explore their
mhm,
identity on their own terms and at their
yeah,
own pace, you
yeah.
know.
Yeah, because like oftentimes our cultures will have no space for anything outside of like heterosexual, violent male sexuality, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes like the whitewashed politics of queerness may not be the solution for all of us, right? And forcing Western ideas of queerness and queer identities on queer people of color may affect our ability to discover like sort of like, you know
Yeah.
versions of queerness that we might come into by ourselves at our own pace. I mean, if white people had 50 years to come figure it out, if Westerners had 50 years to figure out, their queer liberation, we can get some time. We've been colonized for super long. We can have some time. um but yeah, and the thing is that overall, like, sorry, like, to just keep the train going, but like this has like some pretty heavy political implications beyond, like, white wings being like just like a dick to everyone else. And we're gonna put up some readings on homo nationalism, and you should Google it before, and like more, because this is, definitely a big thing. Because this is like how the West leverages, these ideas of Western queerness and co-ops it into these like nationalistic neoliberal like foreign policies, right? And this, can often go beyond issues of just, pink washing and rainbow washing of certain genocidal regimes, that we all know and love. But it has direct positive and negative impacts at the ground level with like NGO work, which can affect, as we were talking about the hijra community, and like, poor women also, like,
Yeah.
poor women can, there's queer people everywhere on, the thing is that, like, and let's not talk about just queer people, but there's just in the global south, like NGO work, a lot of international NGOs and local NGOs will receive international funding, and they'll talk like big game about employing poor women or people from hijra communities to make like safe employment available to them. And in return, they'll be like, oh yeah, we'll be giving you healthcare, housing, food, etc., etc. But often this will end up as another tool for exploitation for even more marginalized cheap labor in the global south. And you can like end up arguing that, like, oh yeah, like, but they're better off, like they have food now, they have shelter now, they have healthcare now, like why are you complaining? The things are not
Yeah.
that simple. There's always like a there it might not end well when they leave, and the ulterior motive and the greater outcome of it might not be that great, because the narrative they're pushing is West good, Islam bad, or something else, whatever is the propaganda of choice at the time. But the thing is that beyond that, when you leave, what happens to these people? I think one good example of this is this like quota process of the garments quota that was in place during the 90s, and
Mhm.
how this was supposed to uplift the developing economies and give them jobs. And what happened in Cambodia is that when it was in place, Cambodia came had a lot of jobs, and all these women had jobs, right? And all these women came up from villages and came to work in these like garments factories. And then as soon as these like quotas ended, and cheap labor came in from other countries, because exploitation, happens more and more when there's more people. Bangladesh and Vietnam like ran in, China came in, and Cambodia's garment sector crashed. And then suddenly all these women didn't have any jobs anymore. Those crumbs that these like companies threw based on this like foreign policies based on like, oh look, west liberal ideas, blah blah blah. And then
Mm.
suddenly these women were forced to engage in sex work, and then HIV rates like rose like exponentially in Cambodia. And the thing is that the butterfly effect is real. Like you can't just do something and then walk out because short term gains isn't a thing, right? There's a
Yeah, and
lot.
I think like the other thing here is that a lot of these organizations, whether it's like, capitalist organizations or even NGOs, they're very rarely actually equipped to deal like with queer issues or
Mm-hmm.
like, issues of like any marginalized community,
Mm-hmm.
because they just don't have the nuance or like the context that these issues deserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they often fail to look at the sort of like, social and cultural context that pre-exist in society. Like they'll ignore things like caste issues. They'll often exist like ethnic sort of like issues within the cultures. They'll often ignore like a lot of things, or they'll sometimes fuel it, they'll because they benefit from it. And that's why, there's the intersectionality is important, and that's why we need people who understand these things to like be looking at these issues and not just be using western catch-all like sort of solutions.
Yeah, and I
So
think like when we talk about intersectionality, that a part of that intersectionality is something that like this movie I'm She Not He also missed, because Living Smile Vidya is an anti-caste and like Dalits rights activist in real life, and this movie actually completely failed to mention or completely ignored, that aspect of her identity.
but yeah, like I think that what I often see in like sort of upper caste Indians, which is majority of the voices that I see online, and sort of like upper caste diaspora Indians in the West, is that
Mm-hmm.
they'll often try to use like colonialism as sort of the catch-all for all South Asian problems, and then
Yeah.
trying to excuse like casteism entirely. And like I'll see this problem with Bangladeshis too, who'll be like, "Oh, we don't have caste. Like caste is a Hindu problem." But it's like caste exists in Bangladesh, bruh. Like also reading in the website, please check. But like the thing is that when the intersectionality of class, caste, location, ethnicity, and pretty much everything manifests into like how queerness, like works for you, like
Mm.
we need to like see that more. Like I think people will, just because it's not shown, people will think it doesn't exist, right? And that's why we really wanted to see like Geely Pucci, which was one of the more recent movies to come out that explores this.
Yeah, and the director of the movie, Neeraj Ghewan, is an openly Dalit director, and he's actually talked about the experience of, coming out, like in terms of his cast in Bollywood, and like the fear
Mhm.
and the all the possible,
Exclusion,
marginalization,
yeah.
yeah, that he's faced. And I think this like sort of goes into like, I mean, caste exclusionary behavior is a regular part of like just the day to day like, life in India, and like particularly, but caste exclusionary behavior as it pertains to queer spaces is something that people rarely talk about. And the thing is that casteism is like super deeply rooted in these queer spaces, that, the openly queer, the queer welcoming spaces that exist in South Asia too, because
Mhm.
a large part of that queer, like of those queer members, are upper class, upper caste, and possibly from urban backgrounds
Mhm.
themselves. So caste is just never like seen as an issue, and it's deeply
Mhm.
exclusionary and also very casteist to people who are from marginalized castes and want
Mm-hmm.
to be in queer
Yeah, and we see it
spaces.
like all the time. Like, like oftentimes these spaces will like just by default will default into like English vocabulary. And like, in
Yeah.
part, like I don't like blame people. I default to English vocabulary all the time. I grew up in Bangladesh. Like you grew up in India. Like will default to English vocabulary for our queer identities all the time, because sometimes it's easier to just understand it and express it than try to trying to express it in like ways that like exist in like our local language, because often in our local languages it feels dirty, because so much of sexuality that isn't like heterosexual, and well, even violent heterosexual male sexuality, that is boys will be boys jokes, everything that is sex or remotely female body related is considered like dirty, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
like and the thing is that like when you choose a language that half the people in your country like don't speak and
Yeah.
don't have access to these words, you are by definition gatekeeping like queerness from like everyone but like upper class people and upper caste people, right? And people from like rural places, like, and then you are not accepting their queerness as something that is like South Asian queerness. But
Yeah,
yeah.
and I mean, we see this all the time, even in terms of, pushing like coming out narratives on like
Mhm.
people from marginalized castes. And this is
Mhm.
something that most upper caste people won't realize, that for someone from a marginalized caste, coming out is not just about their sexuality, right? It's
Mhm.
also about coming out as like a
Yeah.
member of a
Yeah.
caste group. And we see this like in Geeli Pucchi. I think they
Mhm.
portrayed it really nicely when like Konkana Sen Sharma meets like Aditi Rao Hidari for the first time. She like changes her like last name from Mandal, which is her actual last name, to Banerjee, which sort of denotes like upper caste Bengali like last name.
Mhm.
And it's actually easier for her to like, express queer affection
Mhm.
than it is for her to talk about the fact that she's from like a different caste group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like the director talks about this like in like his interviews too, right? And then like, and I think that this contextualizes the movie so much better for us, like how
Absolutely.
like this like whole process of coming out with your cast is just so much more precarious, right? Because you don't
Mm-hmm.
know how they're gonna react, what they're gonna do, and we see that in the movie with Aditi, like how Aditi is ultimately Aditi's character comes out and like is affectionate to Kankana, but then like secretly, I mean, that's how you have to be queer in South Asia. You're secretly queer in South Asia. But the thing is that she's willing to take those risks for her like, queerness, but then she's not willing to take any risks for, the complicity that she
With
has in like sort of the caste oppression in like
mm-hmm.
that she plays a role in, right? And like we see that constantly, whether it's like in the office where like she like lets like her bosses like treat Konkona like shit, or like her like in-laws family where they treat Konkona like shit. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not gonna like, I'm not oppressing you, I'm just here, what can I do, the system is bad. Like we see this all the time, right? People are like, well, I'm not doing anything, like why are you mad at me? Like,
But
and
also you're not doing anything to like make it better. I think
yeah.
that's like the
Yeah,
problem,
and like
right?
I think like people often try to be like, oh yeah, like Aditi's character is just a housewife, and like what power does she have? Like like, well, she's not a housewife, she works, but like what power does she have? Right? She's ultimately oppressed too, and like that's where intersectionality comes in. Bum bum bum, like But that's the thing, like intersectionality works, in that way. Like you can, both of them are working women, but also both of them
And
don't
both
seem
of
to be,
them have to be like under the patriarchy, like
both
they're
of them
still
yeah,
restricted by the
yeah.
patriarchy.
But then like neither of them seem like particularly well off. Like Aditi's family is like well off, but like not significantly well off, like
Yeah.
somewhat well off. But like
Yeah, they have
ultimately
more like social capital than
social
like
capital, yeah. And
yeah.
then like we see like how Aditi's family, ultimate Aditi gets by ultimately on caste, and this is like a good place to see where like like intersectionality works on like multiplication and not on like addition, right? Like it's
Yeah.
amplified, like it amplifies her social standing, it and like
Yeah, it's an exponential like
mhm.
increase or decrease
Yeah,
versus
and the
yeah.
thing is that we see that like like that people from like marginalized intersections of gender, sexuality, and caste, they often have to like hide multiple parts of their identity, not just one, right?
Mhm.
Like, and they have to do this in order to just survive in the public sphere. And like this like all ties into these like ideas of like what is like acceptable, like, and what is
Mhm.
like, deemed right by the upper class, upper caste people, right? This sort of moral policing, this sort of like, like good family policing, this sort of this
Mhm.
that policing. And we see this in the movie where like Konkona ultimately, you know resigns and is like, oh, this relationship isn't gonna work out, but might as well get what I can. Which, good for her, because,
Yeah. I mean,
like
she had to
she
survive.
had
It
to
wasn't.
survive. It's a survival thing, right?
Yeah, it's
And
not like a choice thing. Yeah.
yeah, and we see like, like how like these ideas of intersectionality and like, queerness, we see this in like Made in Heaven too, right?
Mhm.
Like we see this in like Karen's character, who like is the lead boy in the show. And
Mhm.
he's gay, but he's like also like super rich. Like he owns like he like ran like multiple failures of businesses, in the corridors, like to the ground. And he lives in his own apartment, and it's a lot easier to be gay when you have like your own personal spaces, your own fancy clubs, and your friends who are okay with it, like to like just go be like gay, and right. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, it's still hard to be gay in South Asia, but it's a lot easier to be gay when you know that your friend can contact like the like police chief to like get you like out of prison. And it's still like, like, not that Karan's experience in the show isn't dramatic. It
It is,
is.
but it's also like in that sense less dramatic than, someone who wouldn't have those
Yeah.
privileges going through that
Yeah,
experience.
the police is like a tool of the state, and the state is a tool of the like upper class, right? And when the state, like ultimately, Karan has a lot more going for him in this scenario than someone else who would get absolutely nothing from the cops. And we see that in like Naanu Avanalla Avalu, where like they get harassed by the cops and there's nothing to do. And like,
Yeah,
this is just like a, that's the thing, that when you don't have any institutional support, you're right. And your queerness is a lot harder to do like overall in South Asia. But I think that it's important to keep that perspective, like always.
definitely. And speaking of privilege, it's really nice to actually see, all these big name Bollywood actors trying to get on the queer media train now that it's all like cool and trendy, and actually trying to make movies about queer people
Yeah.
that can be watched not just by queer people but also like the general public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, Shubh, Mangal, Zyada, Saavdhaan, and Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga were some of these movies. And while it's really nice to see, slightly more lighthearted, more joyous representations of queer stories. I mean, not everything about like a queer person has to be gritty and dramatic and dark. Um, I think sometimes these movies come off a little bit, especially Shubh Mangal Zyada Saavdhaan came off a bit like a tutorial to me,
Mm-hmm.
and almost like some of these movies kind of exist in this vacuum, or like these queer characters exist in this vacuum, or like they're not even the main focus of the movie. And
Mm-hmm.
we kind of see this like in Kapoor and Sons, where Fawad Khan's character is just there for like, growth for all the straight characters and like resolution
Mm-hmm.
of the
Yeah.
family
And the same
conflict.
thing
So
happened in like Ek Ladki Ko Dekha to Aisa Laga. That same thing. Like it's like she's just there so the main guy can become like a writer, like, which is like, that was a whole thing. Um but
yeah.
yeah, no, like it was like, I mean, it's been a treat though. Like I am definitely like pleased that there's been like more than one movie
Oh
in the
yeah,
last
for
two
sure.
years. And as much as hilarious as it has been to see Sonam Kapoor like try to like fake it, like she's a bad actress, but like also as funny as it was to try to see her like try to like feign the remotest attraction to like a woman, like like I
Even
think that
Ayushman like seemed
I
more
yeah.
into himself as a gay
Yeah.
person versus like into his
Ye-
like boyfriend in
yeah.
the movie.
No, like I think it was really funny. Like I think like the Ayushman movie, like I wish that they like did like focus more. I would really wish that they focus more on like sort of like because they it was more about like it to like I mean we talked about the synopsis, but like in the movie I think that they were just kind of really it became very ham-fisted at one point with the sort of like
Mm-hmm.
comical homophobia thing and whatnot, and then
Definitely.
I kind of really wish, and it never really reached any sort of like point,
Conclusion. Yeah.
conclusion. And I get that they are kind of like all like okay with it at the end, but I wish that there was a better sort of like found family like thing with it. Like I mean, I get
Mm-hmm.
it that they were literal family, but like I wish there was a better family element to it. Like it just seemed like the dad was okay with it and it was fine,
Yeah, I
and
think
none
they
of them
like
ever
just
like
glossed over that acceptance
yeah, I
again,
think it
like
would have been
very.
super fun if like the dad was like super irritated with Ayushman and everybody else was secretly bonding with Ayushman, and then everybody secretly loved Ayushman, and then at the end the dad finally wins over, and then every all of them are like chummy as fuck. Like that would be like that would
Yeah,
be
and
like
I
a
think
bomb queer movie.
like
Like
Ayushman's boyfriend's like
yeah,
cousin is a very
mm,
underutilized character too because
yeah,
she's like technically supportive of their relationship, and
yeah.
I wish they'd like, used
Yeah, I
her more.
would, but like,
Mhm.
yeah, like what we were talking about at the beginning, like the Sonam Kapoor movie, the bits that were good were like the homophobia that they did show in, like not to focus on the trauma of it, but like it felt a lot more realistic in the
Mhm.
Sonam Kapoor movie, and it was just, I also just really liked how much they focused on like just how your family can be very gaslighty, and like how when they are like shitty to other gay people, like it's shitty to be a gay person near your homophobic family even when they're not being homophobic directly to you sometimes. Like
Mhm.
when like, and like they show that, like I think those are like little bits that like did stand out for me in the movie, which were like, yeah, no, that's great. It was super racist to Muslims though, which was a whole thing,
Oh my
but like
gosh.
let's not get into that. Not for this episode. We'll have a whole episode on how Bollywood is racist to Muslims on a
Yeah, all
special
the
episode.
Islamophobia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
special episode. But yeah, no, I think like as we get more and more like queer movies, we'll get to
Mhm.
interact with like more sort of like queerness in South Asian movies, and like how how unique that can be, right? Because like
Mhm.
I think right now they're still going off the recipes from like sort of like
Western movies. Yeah.
Western movies. I did like the one bit in in Ek Larki Ko Dekha where like they're just like they have Sonam Kapoor drawing pictures of like two brides in like saris, and like it's like that's so cute. Like those are like, and that's the thing, like the best part of these movies for me were just seeing like South Asian romance, like film romance scenes, and
Mhm.
subverting them in like sort of like queer ways. Like
True.
seeing like those like images of brides in saris, but two women, or seeing like the train scene, the iconic train scene, but two men, or like
Mhm.
seeing like like two couples sitting in a bike, and they're just being romantic, but it's queer, but like, or like seeing people like in the steps of a fucking like building, and they're drinking chai, and like it's like, and those are those like love moments, like that subversion of like
Yeah.
those images that were so forced into our heads as like sort of cis straight moments, and then
Mhm.
just seeing them as like queer romantic moments has been like the highlight for me for all of this.
Definitely. As we get like these, I mean, we're getting all these like nice moments of,
Mm-hmm.
queer joy, but I think what we'll also get, apart from just generally more queer cinematic elements, is, more queer baiting, which is not good, and maybe more like sensitive queer coding. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just for our audience, like queer baiting is generally understood to be, this viewership gaining tactic,
Mm-hmm.
and it's done with this intent to either, scandalize or titillate or intrigue. And I think the best example for queer baiting is Dostana, which was
Mhm.
sort of like it was announced as this like the first gay movie in Bollywood. And then like you watch it and it's like these two men pretending to be gay, pretending to be gay in the movie too. And
Mhm.
it's just like it was just such a disappointment. And
Mhm.
then yeah, I mean
Yeah, no, I think like Dostana was just such a shit show for so many reasons. And I think like a lot of our audience may be like a very young, but and, like hopefully like I would not want any one of you to like watch it ever.
just
And the thing
don't.
is just don't. It's awful. Like there's no reason to subject yourselves to it. But the thing is like I think to sort of contextualize the movie, like it was like, like when it came out, like we were 12 and like the thing is when it came out, like two of like it was the biggest celebrity movie. It was produced by Karan Johar. I don't think it was directed by Karan
No, it
Johar.
wasn't
And
directed by
then
him. Yeah.
it had John Abraham in it, who was like the hottest person ever at that time. And
Hmm.
it had Priyanka
Priyanka.
Chopra in it for some reason, which is like nobody cared Priyanka Chopra was in the movie. And they're like, oh my god, it has Abhishek Bachchan in it, who like nobody specifically cared about, but was like, okay, like wow, like a big name, person who's gonna be two big name people who are gonna be in it.
I
And
think
like
actually people may have cared about Abhishek Bachchan
yeah,
back
no,
then because he was on like a more like successful role at that
yeah,
time.
people thought that he was gonna like become successful. And
Yeah.
people, like what people think right now with like Ayushman's movie and Sonam Kapoor's movie being out right now, that oh yeah, like we are looking at the future of Bollywood. Queer movies every year now. That's what we thought in 2008. We were sadly mistaken.
Oh
That was
my god.
not happening for us, not in 2008. And like the thing is that when the trailer came out, I think the trailer was like them about to kiss,
Hmm.
and then it flashed out. And I remember this trailer, like I was like, fuck, like we're gonna get so many gay movies. Like next year is it. Like we are like this is it. South Asia queer revolution
South Asia is
here.
like progressing in terms of
Progress, yeah, like
tolerance and
we're
yeah.
here. Like future is here right now, 2008, but no, it was not. And then we watched it, and like we all watched the movie, and we are like, it's ridiculous. We get that disgusting song out of it. And then everyone like vibes to it for some because it's a sadly a bop for some reason. And then we all are sad for the next like what
Decade.
decade, because
Yeah.
like we don't get a queer movie for another like mainstream queer movie for at least another like 12 years, 13 years,
Mm.
my bad. But yeah, it's been a while, but hopefully the queer movie revolution is here in Bollywood.
Finally.
Finally, hopefully, yeah. But yeah, queer
And like
baiting.
yeah, I mean queer baiting is one side of the coin, I guess, which
Mm-hmm.
is what Dostana
Yeah,
did.
and that's the thing, that queer baiting was always a thing in Bollywood.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah,
and
it's
this
like an
is like,
old tactic, yeah.
yeah, and queer baiting was a thing, and queer baiting happened beyond movies. It happened in those Filmfare Awards where they would pick like the twinks of the year. Like, we'd be like, oh yeah, look, Shahid Kapoor
The
and like
chocolate boys,
the
yeah.
chocolate boys, like that's what they called them. And they'd be like, oh yeah, we're gonna pair you up and make you do like homophobic jokes with each other. And
Hmm.
then it would be like very like, but like it would also play into this bizarre like it's homophobic, and it's also very like it was very weird. I don't Entertainment was very odd 15 years
Yeah, it was
ago.
weirdly homoerotic while being homophobic. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was very
it was
odd.
weird and
Yeah.
creepy. Yeah.
But yeah, and then on the flip side of this, we would get movies that were, on the surface super straight, but secretly they were very queer coded, right?
Hmm.
If you want to explain that, like,
Yeah. And I mean, queer coding is like just considered, I think, a lot more neutral and as a way of representing queer characters. And it really allows them to sort of be contextualized to their geographic or socioeconomic location. And interestingly, it was historically used when writers and directors weren't allowed to have like openly out characters
mm-hmm,
unless they were, there to be like traumatized or be joked about.
mm-hmm,
So, I mean, queer coding was almost like this act of like writing or directorial defiance where they coded a character to like appear or to like have some queer traits, and it was supposed to be something that could only be understood by the queer community or like people who were
Mhm.
engaged with the queer community, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, and like I think like this brings us back to Karan Johar again. Um, you know,
Yeah, surprisingly.
surprisingly, but I think that one of my favorite movies growing up. I have watched this movie too many times. Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, which we might do a special on that someday, and like the queer coding on it. But to briefly go over it, if you didn't know, and I don't know, this might just be like me reading a lot into it. Kuch Kuch Hota Hai is very much the first half of Kuch Kuch Hota Hai is very much queer coded, and this often plays into this like idea of like disidentification in like film theory, where
Hmm.
like you'll have this super overtly campy sort of like like just like very like hetero ugly sort of like funny looking sort of character who's like just very bright colors, bright flashy sort of like character who's just ugly in the heterosexual gaze, right? And then this character will end up having this big transformation in the middle, and then will become completely straight, because this
Hmm.
is how you survive in the world. You have to become straight because queerness is ultimately not a way that you can survive in these spaces, right? And we see this in Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. We see Kajol's character, who is tray gay. Like we and like I think some of the scenes where I look back at this movie and like how obsessed I was with this, and I'd be like, how did we miss this? Like she's obsessed.
Seriously.
Like they like make it like if you really look at it, she wasn't as obsessed with Shah Rukh Khan. I mean, she could be bisexual, like bi icon, but
Hmm.
also lesbian icon. Like very much. Like
Yeah,
she was.
and like I feel like it did such a great job of,
Yeah,
portraying that obsession when you're
yeah,
young and like you're exploring your
yeah,
sexuality and you're not like
yeah.
sure whether you're attracted to like
Mm-hmm.
someone of the same like gender or sex, or
Mm-hmm.
whether you just want to be them. And I think they
Mm-hmm.
like really showed that super well now that I look back on it, because I think as queer people we've all like been there, you know.
Yeah. No, like that whole scene where like Kajol's trying to like dress up to impress, like, and like she dresses up like Rani, right?
And
Like
she
she
does it to impress Rani more than
yeah, but
she
then she
does to.
does to to dress up. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like she's dressing up like Rani, so obviously, like she's trying to. She's also like she's trying to impress Shah Rukh Khan, but she's also trying to impress like Rani, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and because she's like still kept a part of like her spandexy sports sort of wear element of it in it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's like a very gay version of Rani that she's dressed as, right? Because if she wanted to just dress as Rani, she could have just dressed as Rani, but she's
Yeah.
not, right? And I think that one of the things that really sort of nails that sort of disidentification for me is the train scene where like we see her sort of like there's that really super sad song playing, and then
Mm-hmm.
we see that she's wearing like white, and it's almost like a funerally moment, and we sort of see like her old identity like die, and it's like a
Mm-hmm.
very marking, like that scene's very marking that sort of moment, right? And when we see her like sort of her dupatta like sort of flies off, it flies off and comes to like Rani, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's in white and the red dupatta lands in Rani, and I think it's very symbolic of that sort of queerness just dying, and she like in the next half of the movie she's the straight girl, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how
Yeah,
she
she's
survives
super
in.
like, yeah, straight after that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's the sad thing, because like often in the real world, being queer isn't easy, and neither was making queer movies in the 90s. Like
Oh
queerness
yeah.
is just simply not easy in South Asia. And I think this like brings us to like, our like sort of like last point, and not to like just tie it into like the movies that we watched, but also just like how difficult being queer can be in like just so many different ways. Like our next like big topic episode is on like consent, and as we were like prepping for this episode, we realized that consent is often a very sort of becomes a very complex thing when you're queer. It's not as straight cut when you're not straight.
Yeah, and
um
consent is already like such a. I mean, even straight men clearly don't understand consent as like a
mhm.
collective group already, but it has
Mhm.
all of these, added layers and nuances within like a queer context, because
Mhm.
oftentimes consent just can't be verbalized in a queer context, because it could mean, outing yourself prematurely, or
Yeah.
like outing yourself accidentally even.
Yeah, and risking your safety, right? And like
Mhm.
this also places like additional issues, like where it's like harder for you to report like sexual assault or violence overall, because you could face further sexual assault by the authorities themselves, right? And the
And
thing
we
is,
see this like even in like the movies that we watched, I think, like, that grayness of consent with like in Nanu Avanalla Avalu, where they're being harassed by the cops, and like there
mhm,
is a genuine fear that there could be like sexual violence from the authorities
mhm.
themselves, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that like we see it in Made in Heaven, and it's good. I mean, on one hand, like, not to say that we need, like, we it's good to see media like highlighting the fact that like how hard it is for like queer people to just navigate all these spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and all that. But like also there's other so many other problems of all of this, right? That media so far up till now, just as we were talking about at the beginning, media has helped to perpetuate the sexual othering of queer and trans people, which means that
Mm-hmm.
they're often looked at as like sort of the perpetrators of sexual violence, despite largely being survivors of it, right? And this can often lead them to just being on the receiving ends of even more violence, like constantly,
Or like
right?
it's completely sort of oppressing their own sexuality for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of, safety, like just
Mm-hmm.
general survival also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is why like I think this whole episode has been so hard for us to like undertake, because there's such a, again, thin line to walk for like South Asian queer people. Like, on one hand there's safety, community, and like, just survival, and then on the other hand there's like self-acceptance, right?
Mhm.
And and just happiness and like mental health, and then you just kind of have to figure out like where you want to sort of go. And it's just something that we have to slowly navigate, and it's like we don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
We've been alive for 26 years, but it took us like like more than like half of it to like come to terms with it, because it's just so hard to even realize. And I think that because of all these sort of difficulties, and even with all our privilege, all these difficulties in sort of everything make it so hard to like sort of understand. And I hope that as media gets better at exploring queer identities, it'll be easier for future queer South Asians to explore their identities, and maybe
Mhm.
come to understand better ways of navigating our identities and accepting it, and breaking down these sort of shitty patriarchal structures and casteist and classist structures that stop us from like being who we are.
While this episode may not be fully comprehensive as a look into queerness in South Asian media or any of the issues that impact queerness, we hope that it can serve as, a starting point to start these discussions
Mm-hmm.
on queerness and the other intersections of our identities and how they all influence each other. And I think like as queerness becomes more mainstream accept gains more mainstream acceptance, we hope that all of these intersections of whether it's class, caste, ability, geographic location, ethnicity, or any of those, they start like being portrayed better, and they have that diversity, because like we've been saying, queerness and other parts of our identity don't exist by themselves or in a vacuum. They're all influenced by each other, and they all compound on each other as well.
And with that, Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Saris on Screen. Make sure to subscribe and drop us some feedback. We're available anywhere that podcasts are platformed. Make sure to also check out our website and follow us on our socials. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next deep dive with Funny Boy, a movie about a young boy exploring his sexuality amidst the ethnic tensions in Sri Lanka in the 1980s. See you then. Bye.